layers of muscle. Layers of muscle. All of that has to be removed, ideally. So, bless you. Yeah, it's just sitting in water. So. But again, that's because the skin is still raw. If it sits too long, just wet, it will rot, start to spoil, go bad. I mean, that's pretty much one of the only weaknesses for parchment is moisture, too much moisture. Parchment is, I mean, and this is a good thing to take note of, which is they have not yet found a point at which parchment will, if left in, let's put it this way, if it's left in a relatively consistent humidity and temperature, it will last indefinitely. They have not found a point at which parchment will break down. Compare that to paper, which you look at a piece of newsprint that's been left out in the sun for more than a day or so, it's already started to yellow. So man-made materials will break down, and a lot of times they break down very, very quickly. So the parchment, as a natural material, it will, it's much stronger, much tougher, will last indefinitely. So, all right. But its one advantage or disadvantage is that if the stuff gets wet, or stays damp for too long, it will start to rot. All right, and some other things that people have to sort of be aware of when they're handling parchment is that it may look like paper in a lot of cases, but it doesn't act like paper. It's a lot stronger than paper. It's grown as opposed to made by machine or by hand. Excuse me, but it's meant to be wrapped around an animal. So it's not meant to be flat. So we can flatten it here, you can end up with something that looks like that. But as soon as you take it down off of that frame, it's going to start moving around ever so slightly, but it will move around more or less depending on changes in humidity. The drier it is, the more it will sort of contract and start to warp. The more damp an environment, the more it will sort of relax and get very drapey. So, but because it's meant to be wrapped around something, you're sort of having to be creative with how you stretch it to sort of take up all of that slack. I mean, these areas here, this isn't all meant to be flat. It's all meant to be sort of wrapped around the leg. So when you are trying to stretch it all out and make it flat, you have to sort of stretch it from several different directions at once. And you guys are free to come up and touch it and feel it if you want. So yeah, it's very rubbery, very slick, spongy.
Is there somewhere I can stick this? Just. No, stop it. It keeps touching my hoodie and
Go back, touch things.
All right, and it's also, it's obviously getting bigger as I stretch it. It can withstand an awful lot of stretching. It's a very, very elastic material when it's wet. When it's dry, it becomes much more inflexible. So, and it doesn't really. You think it's an animal skin, it's going to behave like leather, but no, it does not. So. this is one more reason why parchment is such an expensive material, is because there isn't really any way around having to stretch it by hand. So each individual skin needs this attention in order to be done properly. So this is part of why it's such a labor-intensive process.
Crazy, or are those rib marks? Am I crazy, or are those rib marks like around the spine?
No, I see it.
I see it.
That's so cool.
I thought you said ring pops, and I was like, there's...
You're crazy.
Okay. That's taking up a lot of the slack. And readjust a little bit as I go. These frames are kind of tall. Not good for most of the people that come and take the workshop, but they are sort of a necessity because sometimes the skins that we use end up being, 4 or 5 feet long. So you kind of have to have large frames in order to accommodate that. But, all right, so the skin it's pretty well stretched, but there's still a lot of muscle, fiber stuff. I mean, this is a calf skin, so you're going to see a lot more of this on a calf than you would elsewhere. All of that needs to come off, whether it's done now or when the skin is dry. But you can see the spine. These right here, that's where the back strap muscles are on the hide. So you'll often see those veins that sort of protrude out from the spine right there. Right about here, this is the rump area, and usually on either side of the spine, right about here and here, there will be these sort of spots that tend to be a little stretchier than other areas of the hide. And that's because they are meant to drape over the pelvis of the animal. They are meant to protrude, so they tend to be baggier than other areas. And it took me a while to figure that out, but another aspect about parchment, which is important, is that if parchment isn't stretched under tension, it will dry clear, it will dry translucent, which is why, around the edges of the hide right here, where it hasn't been fully stretched, it will be glassy and you can see through it. So if the skin is stretched and it's not been stretched completely, it will dry translucent. So I would often end up getting spots, like clear spots, right about here, and could not figure out what that was caused by. I thought maybe it was grease or something that was doing it. But then I finally realized that it's because they haven't been completely scraped out, because they're so much baggier than the surrounding areas of the hide. So it requires a little extra work to go, when the skin is a little drier, to scrape those out. at this point I could leave the hide and it would dry eventually, but because it's still really, really wet, it would take an awful long time to dry. So what I would prefer to do, what I will do, is I will actually scrape the hide and wring out a lot of the extra water. So, and for that I use this tool here. Okay, parchment making as a profession doesn't really exist anymore, hasn't for several hundred years. So there aren't really tools around for it, which means that it's necessary to sort of appropriate tools from other places. This is actually a leather paring knife that we got from a company in France, but it works really well for this because it has the curved edge, right? And why that's important is, if you'll notice, when you stretch on this or push on it, it will bow under pressure. If you were to use a flat edge, flat knife, then it would basically only end up touching right at the edges of that knife, and you would not really be able to scrape anything. You would just cut the skin to ribbons. So it's important that the knife has a curved edge to it, so it can conform to the bellying out of the hide. This sort of a tool, back in the Middle Ages, was referred to as a lunellum, which means moon knife in Latin, for obvious reasons. There's several different iterations of it. This, again, was sort of a tool appropriated from something else, so it doesn't really work great. It works well enough for this part of the process, which is I'm just trying to squeegee out the excess water that's in it. Right? So what I'm going to try to do is put my hands close to the blade and then scrape to wring out the excess water. We'll see how much water comes off.
Oh, wow.
So, you can see there's a lot of water. I'm putting a lot of pressure on it. The skin is deceptive in that you think it might not be able to withstand an awful lot of tugging, but it can actually put up with quite a lot. So, and the more you push on it, the more water you'll bring out. But it's also important to sort of, when you do it, keep it perpendicular to the skin surface. You're not petting the skin, and you never want to go this way. You always want to go that way, sort of with the flat edge of the blade. Anyone want to give it a try? You can go harder. Good way to build up, arm strength and calluses. Okay. Anyone else?
Sure. Can you go? Yeah, thanks.
And you might notice that as you go, the skin tends to get, baggier in the frame. So as you're scraping it, the skin fibers are actually sort of pulling apart a little bit. So we take this opportunity to go around and sort of retension all of the ropes around the edges. this is probably not even a 2-week-old cat. This one here, and this is probably, I'd say, an 8 to 9 square foot high, 8 to 9 square feet area. So it's pretty big. Anyone else? No? Come on, guys. You at least have to look like you want to be here, right? So, and this is actually pretty. If it wasn't for the rod on the other side, this would be nice. There's not too many holes in the center. Pretty good job butchering it. So, you see what happened? It just popped a hole in it. I mean, and you can see that was a cut, flesh cut, and because it was very close to the other side of the skin, you put too much pressure on it, and it's going to pop a hole. So. And now that the skin is on the frame and it's still wet, I could actually, if I felt like it, try to sew it closed. You know, I could take a needle and thread and try to sew that closed. And sometimes they do that, and partly just the chemical makeup of the skin allows it so that if you get the skin too hot, if you scald it with hot water, it will actually sort of melt the collagen fibers together. So in some cases you could sew that closed, hit it with a little spot of scalding water, and it would melt those fibers closed again, and then you could unthread it, and it would actually, you would have gotten rid of the hole. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay. If you guys want to come take a look at, well, actually, yeah, I mean, you can if you want. Should get a light over here.
Isn't it a silent part of it? Is this stereo? Sure. Yeah, that's cool. I'll give you that one early.
It's always nice to have a pretty bright light source handy. Directional light. All right, and these areas are rot, those brown areas. But you can see all of those wrinkles on the hide too. Those are fat wrinkles. Those aren't necessarily veins. You can tell sort of because they happen pretty regular intervals, and they all tend to radiate away from the spine. But I can use this opportunity to sort of clean up and squeegee the grain side of the skin too. And you can see some of the stuff that's coming off there. It has a little bit of color to it. What I'm actually doing is I'm scraping out some of the hair follicles that were left behind, and I'm actually, removing hair roots and getting rid of air bubbles in the process. Those air bubbles, if you're not careful, those could end up drying in there, and then you'll end up with a bumpy skin surface. feel it as you put your hand across it. What the rot is bacteria attacking the skin, and as a result it will degrade and sort of remove some of the grain surface, so it ends up feeling rougher than the surrounding skin, which means it's been compromised. If you try to dye this or something, this is basically the way into the skin, those areas. If you think of skin as, sometimes when we dye a skin, which we'll sometimes do, the color ends up taking much more to the flesh side of the skin than the grain side, and that's mainly because the grain side of the skin is very impermeable, where the flesh side has, it's very porous. The outside of the skin, if you think of your skin, it's meant to keep things out, so it's meant to be impermeable. The other side, very fibrous, it absorbs color and moisture and humidity much faster than the other side of the skin. So, but you'll see bacterial damage on the skin is oftentimes if there's scrapes or cuts in the skin, where the grain has been compromised. That's how the bacteria can get in and do damage. All right. Unfortunately, you guys won't be here tomorrow to see what it looks like when it's dry, but all right, but when a skin is dry, I can find one. Very large, primitive phylum system.
Sounds very pretty.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that's a calf. That's a Holstein.
Flipping baggage.
What's that?
What? Oh, I said a flipping baggage.
Yes, these spots there, those hip spots I was talking about, and you can see, like analog, and then sort of those little areas of the baggy areas. Somebody actually doing some interior design project was looking for a very high relief black and white spotted calf. So he was doing several for that. That's a calf. That's probably maybe 2 weeks old. Maybe not even 2 weeks old. This is also a calf. This is probably a month old, but still pretty big. Also fairly thick, and a little translucent towards the center here, which means it wasn't quite scraped well enough. But here you can also see a lot of the veins on the hide, a lot of the fat wrinkles down here, okay, spine, flank areas, armpits, groin area, right? But this one, because it's nice and thick, here's a bunch of, those are not a very good butchering job. Lots of flesh cuts there, but I think because the skin is thick enough, it will probably make it so that those won't end up being a problem on the other side of the skin, right? But the skin is pretty thick, which means that if we were going to use it for a manuscript page, we would need to thin it down considerably in order to, I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but there was a project that had been done recently where people were trying to figure out how is it they managed to make this super thin, like tissue thin parchment for the daily devotional books, the Paris Bibles, which are, the books are like this big, to be able to, get 100 pages in a book that's only this thick means that it has to be like, 0.01 millimeters thick or something ridiculously thin like that. So how is it they were able to do that? You know, is it starting with fetal calfskin, which was one thought people had was, you know, well, you just get calf when they're really, really young, get them when they're still, you know, in the uterus. And while fetal calfskin, which we sometimes use, we call it slunk. That's the industry name. They use a lot of that now. And in the present day, there are hundreds, thousands of slunk that are, you know, butchered and skinned every day. That is mainly a result of the fact that, you know, this is a big country. We have, next to Brazil, I didn't realize Brazil was the largest population of cows in the world is in this country. So we raise a lot of beef here. So at any one point, you know, during the day, there are 45 to 50 million cows in this country. A certain percentage of them are going to be slaughtered, you know, for beef, and a certain percentage of those are going to be possibly pregnant cows. So what they will do is they will then take the fetus and skin the fetus, and they will make parchment out of that. USDA regulations won't let you actually sell the meat for human consumption. So they'll use the carcass for animal food or something, dog food, but the skin they are allowed to save. So they will skin it, and they'll keep those hides, and then oftentimes they'll put them in a container, send them over, you know, thousands at a time in a container over to Israel, where they are often used for kosher Torah scrolls, for parchment over there. So not too many of them end up staying here. The demand is much higher over there, but you know, occasionally we will get some. But this is where they all come from, or a lot of them come from. So the question was, could they have been using fetal calf to make this super thin parchment? Because you start with something that thin already, it makes it a lot easier. But then someone pointed out that if they had used fetal calfskin parchment to make all of these books that are in existence, they would have basically exterminated the entire bovine race. There would be no cows left. So then they said, well, it's got to be something else. What else? You know, what could it be? And then a lot of research has been done, and the theory has been made that it wasn't an issue of using the proper hides. It was all about the craftsmanship and the skill used to actually make the parchment. So somebody who does this for, you know, thousands and thousands of hours. I mean, there's a Malcolm Gladwell book where he talks about outliers being, you know, mastery and what it takes to become a master. And it's like at least 10,000 hours in something is, you know, what you need to do in order to be able to have some level of skill. And probably much more than that. But if you have been doing something for that long, hopefully you will be good enough at it so that you can actually make exactly what they're looking for. So that means that you have to be good with a knife and be able to shave this down so, you know, within an inch of its life, so that you'll end up with some really nice thin parchment. But it would probably take an awful long time if you're not good. It still might take a long time if you're really good at it. But so that's one theory as to how it was made. But when we are taking a hide like this and want to thin it down, especially if it's a larger hide, we need to be able to remove and shave off a lot of this. Nowadays we use machines, sanders, you know, power sanders, or large drum sanders, which are, you know, 5 feet wide, and you put a whole skin in, feed it through, and it will actually, you know, just sand off, you know, a certain, you know, thickness every pass. But they didn't necessarily have access to tools like that 500 or 600 years ago. So what did they do instead? They would use knives. For that we have, and these are some knives that are actually made. So this one here, these are sort of more standard iterations of a Lumellum. Okay, and I made this one here, looking at an old illustration, medieval illustration, Der Pergamenter, you know, some old guy wearing peasant's clothes, you know, with this against the skin. So I said, okay, well, I guess the idea is, you know, you take a round blade, you know, have handles on either side, and make sure that it's sharp on one edge. And this works an awful lot better than that little knife I had, because 2 handles, but handles perpendicular to the blade makes it so that you can cock the blade a little bit and gives you a lot more control over it. It's also a much bigger surface area, coverage area, and it also weighs a lot. So it's got some heft to it, which means that when you swing it across the skin, its momentum will help to keep it going, right? And what's also important is that when you're doing it, you're trying to shave off parts of the skin. So it's not just going to be like a super sharp edge all the way across. You want to make it nice and sharp, but then you actually want to turn the edge over ever so slightly to create what's called a burr. Okay, so it's basically a teeny microscopic hook just on one side of the blade. And that hook is what is actually going to be removing the parchment as you scrape it. And if you guys if you want to feel it, run your hand along one edge and then back across the other, and you can actually feel there is like a little teeny, your finger catches a little bit when you rub it from the other edge. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do now is run this on the skin and see if anything comes off. Whoa. So that is parchment scrap. It's pretty good. It helps to have a really thick skin. It makes it a little easier to get, a lot of the shavings off, but and that would make good glue. If you think of if you guys have ever heard of hide glue, okay, it's a very very old glue, which is basically just gelatin, and you would take either hide substance or cartilage or bone and just boil the heck out of it until it is just boiled down into like a really thick glue, which is basically what it is. But something like this is fairly pure, without a lot of other, nasty bits in it. So something like that you could soak it in water, and then boil it, or not even boil it, but heat it slowly over a long period of time. Eventually it would condense down into something that would make a good glue. They would also use it as size, like if you've ever seen people or heard of people when they make paper, they'll make the paper, but then they'll actually coat it with gelatin. And that gelatin actually is what helps those paper fibers glue to each other. And in the process, it also increases the strength of the paper an awful lot. And somebody had a theory that part of the reason why they used parchment size on paper was when there was that crossover period between paper making, or between parchment and then the introduction of paper. People were unfamiliar with paper, so they were less likely to use it. So somebody thought, well, if I made this stuff look more like parchment, maybe that would be, it would make it more appealing to them. So they basically, took gelatin glue, swabbed it all over the paper, and then only afterwards realized, wow, and I've seen people do experiments on paper, whether it's sized or unsized, and they'll do those tests to see how many times you can fold it before it breaks. Unsized paper lasts, maybe 15 folds. Sized paper lasts like 400 plus. So it increases the strength immensely. So this obviously works pretty well. You can shave off a lot fairly quickly. But when you're done, you have certainly thinned the parchment down. This is still pretty thick. It would take a good long time to thin this down. It's a good exercise. But after you do that, the surface is still probably a little rough. So you need to be able to clean the surface and smooth it down so that it's more prepared for writing. And for that, before I go there, there's also this knife here. This one somebody made for me. Looking at, they said, well, what kind of a knife are you looking for? What are the details, dimensions? So they made this, and this is sort of machine steel. It has a nice edge on one side. Also lignum vitae handles, so it's really nice and hefty and really dense wood. And you can also unscrew it, take it apart, which is nice. And this one works okay also, but the other one for me works better because the handles are longer and the blade is longer, and sometimes I will end up scuffing my knuckles on this thing. So. And another thing which is of interest to some people is when you obviously heard the noise that this thing made. I was talking before about the idea of mastery. People, you know, supposedly, if you are really, really good at making parchment, you should be able to tell by the sound that the skin makes when you run the blade over it, whether it's the right thickness or not. Because the pitch will change depending on how thin the skin is. At a certain point, it gets to the right spot, and if you know what to listen for, you'll say, all right, it's thin enough, I'll stop there. So I have not come anywhere near reaching that point myself. But it's still interesting, you know, the noise, the singing of the blade is how they refer to it as. And somebody else, another medieval studies professor, actually came by here last year and was studying particularly the sounds of medieval culture, and something like this might be a sound that they would have heard, which you would never really hear anywhere. So, which I thought was interesting. All right, so now I've scraped the skin, thinned it down some, but you can see there's a lot of obvious marks on here. And this is another thing which you can sometimes see if you look on old manuscript pages, examine them closely, is you'll see these marks on there, these chatter marks. And that's basically from running the skin across here, and then it sort of imperceptibly, sort of jumps along the surface. And if you look at old manuscript pages, you'll sometimes see those striations on there, which means that the skin has been shaved and it wasn't entirely cleaned up afterwards. So, but in order to clean it up, anyone tell me what these might be?
Yeah.
Sorry? That one is pumice.
This is really light.
Yeah. Full of lots of air. That floats.
Really?
So pumice works really well for something like this. But if you don't happen to live near a, flaming, spewing volcano, what do? This is actually a loaf of bread with ground glass in
I
it.
thought it was a silly thing to suggest.
What's that?
I thought that was a silly thing to suggest. It's a loaf of bread flashing in my mind.
It's a loaf of bread with ground glass in it. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to use glass. You could use sand if it was available. You could just use sand all by itself, maybe. But right, so they would basically make their own sanding blocks. And I just Googled, how to make your own bread or how to make Play-Doh, and I found this recipe and just took a wine bottle, ground it up with a mortar and pestle, and I tried a few different sort of like size granules. Some which was really coarse, and then some which was a lot finer, to see what would work the best. And I had seen mention of it somewhere in a recipe in one of the old books, is that they would this is what they would do if they in the absence of